March 31st, 1944, Northern Italy. The war had long since turned against the Axis, yet amid the ruins of Turin's bombed-out factories, Italian engineers were still building something remarkable. The aircraft was sleek, silver, and deadly, the Fiat G.55 Centauro. For Allied pilots, who had once mocked Italian fighters as flimsy, underpowered, and outdated, this machine was a revelation. When Allied engineers examined the first captured G.55 at the end of March 1944, they could hardly believe it was Italian. Gone were the fabric wings and fragile frames of earlier designs like the Machi C200 Saetta or the Fiat G50 Freccia. In their place stood a modern all-metal monoplane with lines as graceful as the Spitfire and the raw power of a Messerschmitt. The Centauro was born out of desperation. By late 1942, Italy's Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, was fighting with aircraft that belonged to another era. In North Africa and the Mediterranean, Italian pilots faced the latest Allied designs, the P-40 Warhawk, the Spitfire Mk5, and later the P-38 Lightning. The Italians fought bravely, but suffered terrible losses. Their fighters could not climb fast enough, could not turn tightly enough, and could not catch their enemies in level flight. At Fiat's experimental division, engineer Giuseppe Gabrielli decided to change that. Gabrielli had been designing aircraft since the 1930s, but the G.55 would be his masterpiece, a fusion of Italian craftsmanship and German technology. In 1942, Italy received the rights to produce the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, the same power plant used in Germany's Bf-109G, and later the Bf-110. It was a liquid-cooled V12 engine capable of delivering over 1,450 horsepower. Gabrielli's team designed an entirely new airframe around this engine, aerodynamic, elegant, and robust. The result was the G.55 Centauro, or Centaur, a name that perfectly symbolized the combination of human intellect and raw mechanical power. The first prototype flew in April 1942. And from the very first test, pilots realized something was different. The Centauro handled beautifully, even at high altitudes where many Italian fighters struggled. It could reach speeds of up to 620 kilometers per hour, and more importantly, it retained its agility and stability, where most other fighters became unpredictable. Its climb rate, acceleration, and roll response were excellent. Inside the cockpit, the pilots sat behind thick armored glass, a rare luxury for Italian aircraft at the time, and above self-sealing fuel tanks that dramatically reduced the chance of fire when hit. The construction quality was superb. Every panel fit tightly. The canopy provided excellent visibility, and the controls were balanced and smooth. When the Allies finally got their hands on a fully intact G.55, the comparison tests were astonishing. Against the Spitfire Mk9 and the P-51B Mustang, the Centauro held its own. In some respects, particularly high-altitude maneuverability, it even surpassed them. But perfection came at a price. Each G.55 required more than 15,000 man-hours to produce, nearly 3 times that of a German Bf-109. Italy's industrial base was already stretched thin by 1943. And Allied bombing campaigns on Turin, Milan, and Naples crippled production further. Even before Italy's surrender in September 1943, only a handful of G.55s had reached operational squadrons. After the armistice, chaos reigned. The Regia Aeronautica fractured. Some pilots fled south to join the Allies, while others stayed in the north, fighting under the newly formed Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, loyal to Mussolini's German-backed Italian Social Republic. It was under this desperate regime that the Centauro would fight its final battles. The Germans, impressed by the aircraft's performance, quickly seized the remaining factories and ordered continued production. They even considered manufacturing the G.55 in Germany under license. A Luftwaffe evaluation report described it as one of the best Axis fighters of the war. But by then, it was too late. Allied bombers controlled the skies over northern Italy, and every shipment of materials, every new aircraft, was a target. Workers labored under constant threat of air raids and food shortages. Many were forced to work for the German war effort at gunpoint. In the few squadrons that received the Centauro, pilots spoke of it with reverence. "It was the first Italian fighter that made us feel equal," one pilot later recalled. "We could finally fight the Americans and the British on the same level." The G.55's armament reflected its new role as a serious frontline interceptor. Most versions carried a 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub, along with two synchronized 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns above the engine and two more 20mm cannons in the wings. Later versions, designed for the Luftwaffe, added heavier armament and fuel capacity. In combat, the Centauro proved deadly against Allied bombers. Pilots from the Italian Social Republic used it to intercept B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators over northern Italy in 1944 and 1945. Its combination of climb rate, stability, and heavy cannon made it one of the few Axis aircraft capable of closing in on the four-engine giants and surviving the encounter. Still, production never exceeded 270 aircraft. The numbers simply weren't enough to matter. While Germany could build thousands of Bf-109s a month, Fiat's battered Turin facilities could produce only a handful of G55s. Supply chains collapsed. Aluminum ran short. Skilled workers were conscripted or killed. By the spring of 1944, Allied air superiority was absolute. No matter how capable the Centauro was, it could not change the outcome. Italian pilots flew it with courage, but they fought a losing war. A war that had already been lost before their engines even started. And yet, the G.55 refused to disappear into obscurity. After the war, several airframes survived. Fiat engineers returned to what remained of their factories and resumed limited production under the name Fiat G.55A for the newly formed Italian Air Force. A few were exported to Argentina and Egypt, where they flew into the early 1950s. Today, aviation historians regard the Centauro as the finest Italian fighter of World War II, perhaps one of the best piston engine fighters ever built. Its balance of power, agility, and craftsmanship placed it in the same league as the Spitfire, Mustang, and Bf-109. But its story is more than just technical achievement. It is the story of a nation's engineers and pilots who refused to surrender their pride, even as their country fell apart around them. In every rivet and curve of the G.55 lies the spirit of a country torn between collapse and brilliance. A masterpiece born too late to save its creator. As 1944 progressed, the Fiat G.55 continued to serve in scattered units across northern Italy. Its production lines, however, told a darker story, one of resilience under occupation and the slow, methodical destruction of Italy's industrial heart. Turin, once a proud symbol of Italian engineering, now lay in ruins. Allied bombing raids targeted factories, rail yards, and power stations. Every new Centauro that left the assembly line was a small miracle of endurance. Fiat's engineers, still led by Giuseppe Gabrielli, worked with whatever resources they could salvage. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecked aircraft. Aluminum came from melted down civilian goods. Skilled workers risked arrest or death to remain at their posts. Some deliberately slowed production as a form of resistance. Others continued simply out of pride in their craft. To the Germans, the Centauro represented a missed opportunity, proof that Italian engineering, when properly supplied, could match the Luftwaffe's finest designs. They conducted extensive trials, comparing it to the Messerschmitt Bf-109G10 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A-8. The results were surprising even to them. At altitudes above 7,000 meters, the Fiat G.55 demonstrated smoother handling and superior stability compared to the Bf-109. Its larger wings gave it excellent lift and control in thin air, while its DB605 engine performed reliably in long climbs. Test pilots noted that the aircraft felt lighter on the controls and less demanding than the German fighters. In a rare moment of technical admiration, German evaluators described the Centauro as a near-perfect synthesis of power and grace. Some Luftwaffe officers even suggested shifting limited production capacity from the 109 to the Italian design. But the idea was rejected. Germany's factories were already overstretched, and retooling for a foreign design in 1944 was impossible. Meanwhile, in the skies above the Po Valley, Italian pilots fought a lonely, hopeless campaign. The Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana fielded a few squadrons of G.55s, mostly from Gruppo Caccia, Montefusco Bonnet. They flew interception missions against the American 15th Air Force, whose bombers struck northern Italian cities daily. The odds were staggering. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, filled the sky. The Italian pilots often took off in groups of 6 or 7. They would climb toward the silver formation, glinting in the sun, their engines straining, hearts pounding. For many, it was a one-way flight. But when the Centauro engaged, it struck with deadly precision. Its central 20mm cannon could rip through a bomber's fuselage in seconds. When a formation of G.55s caught the bombers unguarded, they inflicted real damage. Allied crews learned to respect, and fear, the Italian interceptors that emerged suddenly from the haze over the Alps. One American pilot, flying a P-38 Escort, later recalled, "We didn't expect much from Italian fighters anymore, but the G.55, that was a different beast. It climbed like a Messerschmitt and turned like a Spitfire. You didn't underestimate it twice." Despite isolated victories, the overall situation for Italy's northern forces remained dire. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Ammunition was scarce. Replacement parts were nearly impossible to find. Every sortie became a gamble. In Turin, Gabrielli and his engineers received news from the front lines with mixed pride and sorrow. Their creation had proven itself in combat, but it was being used in a war that Italy no longer truly fought. The nation had split in two. The south under Allied control, the north under German occupation. In between lay chaos. Gabrielli's notes from 1944 reflect this duality. "We build machines for a country that no longer exists," he wrote, "but to stop building is to die." By late 1944, the Germans began transferring their attention to jet-powered designs, the Messerschmitt Me 262 and the Heinkel He 162. Propeller-driven aircraft like the G.55, no matter how advanced, were suddenly relics of a vanishing era. Still, the Centauro continued to fly. In the skies over Bologna and Verona, its elegant silhouette stood out against the grey smoke of burning cities. The G.55 wasn't just fast, it was beautiful. Aviation photographers and Allied intelligence officers would later marvel at its lines. The long nose tapering gracefully into a cockpit canopy with near-perfect visibility. The broad wings curving slightly at the tips, the streamlined tail giving it a look of predatory balance. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like an artist's dream of flight. Yet, even beauty could not save it. By the winter of 1944-45, production had slowed to a trickle. Allied bombing raids in February 1945 destroyed what remained of Fiat's main assembly halls. The few surviving G.55s were hidden in barns and hangars, protected by mechanics who hoped one day Italy might rise again and fly them under a new flag. In April 1945, Mussolini's regime collapsed. German troops retreated north. The war in Italy ended not with a glorious last stand, but with exhaustion. Many of the surviving Centauros were abandoned where they sat, elegant machines left in the mud as their pilots surrendered. When Allied forces entered Turin, they found the remains of Fiat's aviation division in remarkable order. Amid shattered glass and bomb craters, engineers had preserved blueprints, tools, and jigs for the G.55's construction. To the astonishment of Allied inspectors, production had continued right up until the final days. In May 1945, one British engineer wrote in his report, "The Fiat G.55 represents the pinnacle of Italian wartime aeronautical engineering. Were it not for the circumstances of its nation's defeat, it could have played a decisive role in the air war over Europe." That assessment was not mere politeness. The G.55's performance figures rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, those of the latest Allied fighters. Its top speed of 385 miles per hour placed it between the Spitfire Mk 9 and the early P-51B. Its climb rate and high-altitude stability were exceptional, and pilots praised its ruggedness, a trait rarely associated with Italian aircraft. In post-war Italy, these qualities made the Centauro a symbol of rebirth. Fiat engineers, freed from German supervision, returned to the design and began rebuilding the aircraft for the new Italian Air Force, the Aeronautica Militare. The new version, the G.55A, was stripped of heavy wartime equipment and modified for training and light fighter roles. The early years of peace were difficult. Italy's economy was shattered, its infrastructure broken, and its aviation industry nearly erased. Yet the G.55 survived. In 1946, the first post-war Centauro took flight. A small act of defiance, a symbol that Italian craftsmanship still lived. For a time, it seemed the aircraft might even find a new life abroad. Argentina, seeking to modernize its air force, purchased a batch of G.55s, along with a license to produce them locally. In South America, the sleek Italian fighter flew again, this time under blue skies, far removed from Europe's ruins. But the jet age was already upon the world. The same year Argentina received its Centauros, Britain introduced the Gloster Meteor, and the United States fielded the F-80 Shooting Star. The piston engine fighter, no matter how refined, was becoming obsolete. By the early 1950s, the last operational G.55s were retired. A few were preserved in museums, others were scrapped quietly, their aluminum recycled into the new civilian airliners of post-war Europe. Today, only a handful survive, silent witnesses to an age when beauty and tragedy shared the same sky. To stand beside one in a museum is to see both the dream and the defeat of a nation. The Fiat G.55 was not just an aircraft. It was a final statement from a country that refused to be defined by its failure. Its designer, Giuseppe Gabrielli, went on to lead Italy into the jet era, creating the Fiat G.91, the first Italian jet fighter to enter NATO service. In many ways, the G.55 was the bridge between the past and the future, between the romanticism of propeller flight and the cold precision of the modern jet. When historians look back at the air war over Europe, they often speak of the Spitfire, the Mustang, and the Messerschmitt. But those who know the deeper story always include one more name: the Centauro, the Italian fighter that arrived too late to change history, yet early enough to prove what Italian ingenuity could achieve under fire. The Fiat G.55 remains a paradox. The best fighter built by a nation already defeated, a masterpiece that flew in the shadow of ruin, a symbol of how excellence can emerge even from despair. After the smoke of war had cleared and Italy began to rebuild, the legacy of the Fiat G.55 lingered in the minds of engineers and pilots alike. It was more than a machine. It was proof that even in the darkest days, Italy's spirit of innovation had not died. In 1946, when the shattered remains of Fiat's aeronautical division reopened its doors, the first task was to assess what could be salvaged. Much of the equipment had been destroyed by bombing or looted by retreating German forces, but remarkably, the core design documents of the G.55 survived. Blueprints, production jigs, and the test notes of Giuseppe Gabrielli's original team were preserved by engineers who had hidden them in underground shelters during the final months of the war. From this foundation, Fiat engineers rebuilt. The first new aircraft rolled out in 1947, designated G.55A, the post-war Centauro. It was slightly modified. The guns were removed or reduced, the cockpit updated, and certain systems simplified for training use. The goal was not to return to combat, but to teach a new generation of pilots how to fly. The newly formed Aeronautica Militare Italiana adopted the aircraft as its first post-war fighter trainer. For many young Italian aviators, their first flight was in the seat of a G.55, the same machine that had once fought under the banner of a lost regime. Now it carried the tricolor of the new Italian Republic. To these pilots, the G.55 symbolized redemption. It was living proof that Italian engineering could compete with the best of the world, even after total defeat. Veterans of the wartime Regia Aeronautica, many of whom had flown obsolete biplanes or underpowered monoplanes, marveled at the Centauro's continued grace. Its flight characteristics were gentle but precise, and its structure, built with the care of artisans, aged beautifully. Foreign observers also took notice. In 1947, British and American advisors stationed in Italy examined the rebuilt Centauros and were impressed by their workmanship. Though the design was already considered outdated by Western standards, it was recognized as a world-class piston fighter, on par with the late-war Spitfire G.55 and the P-51D. Then came the export orders. Argentina, emerging as a regional power and seeking to establish an independent defense industry, looked to Europe for aircraft that could be locally produced. The G.55 caught their eye. The Argentines purchased several dozen aircraft and secured a license for domestic production. In Buenos Aires, the Centauro found new life. Under the name Fuerza Aérea Argentina, the aircraft trained young pilots who would later transition to jets. Italian technicians traveled across the Atlantic to assist in assembly and maintenance, creating a quiet bridge between the ruins of Turin and the optimism of South America. For a few brief years, the skies of Argentina echoed with the sound of the Italian V12 engine, the same deep growl that once roared over the Mediterranean. Local pilots adored the aircraft for its balance and stability. "It felt like dancing with the air," one Argentine officer recalled. "You didn't fight the controls, you guided them, and the airplane followed like a living thing." But the march of technology was relentless. By 1950, jet engines had changed the very nature of flight. The age of the piston engine, the age of propellers and roaring mechanical symphonies, was ending. The Centauro, despite its beauty and performance, belonged to the past. Giuseppe Gabrielli saw this clearly. Always a visionary, he shifted Fiat's focus toward jet propulsion. Using lessons learned from the G.55, he began developing the G80 and G82, Italy's first indigenous jet trainers. By the mid-1950s, his designs culminated in the Fiat G.91, a sleek, swept-wing jet that would become NATO's light fighter standard. And yet, Gabrielli never forgot the Centauro. In interviews later in life, he spoke of it with quiet pride. "It was the perfect airplane for a country that was imperfect," he once said. "It represented what we could do when given freedom, and what we lost when that freedom disappeared." Even decades later, aviation historians and engineers continued to analyze the G.55 structure. The aircraft's frame was over-engineered by the standards of wartime production. Strong, resilient, and meticulously crafted. It could withstand high stress loads and damage that would have torn lighter fighters apart. Some experts called it too good, arguing that such precision and durability came at the cost of speed and mass production. Indeed, the G.55's greatest flaw had always been its perfection. It demanded attention, time, and labor that a wartime economy could not afford. Each rivet was polished, each panel hand-fitted. It was a craftsman's aircraft built in an age of assembly lines. If the Bf-109 was the symbol of efficiency and standardization, the G.55 was its opposite, the expression of artistry in metal. It was the fighter equivalent of a Ferrari in a field of Volkswagens. In another world, one with peace and prosperity, such a design might have defined the future of aviation. The tragedy of Italian aviation during World War II was not a lack of talent, but a lack of means. Italian engineers knew how to build extraordinary machines, but they lacked the resources, materials, and political stability to realize them in numbers that mattered. The G.55 was proof of concept for what could have been an Italian air power renaissance. Even the Allies, victorious and pragmatic, recognized this. Post-war technical reports from the Royal Air Force and the US. Army Air Forces praised the Centauro's aerodynamics and combat capabilities. One American analysis from Wright Field in Ohio concluded that the Fiat G.55 is among the most refined fighter designs encountered among Axis equipment. It demonstrates a level of aerodynamic sophistication comparable to late-model Spitfires. But the same report noted the fatal weakness: production inefficiency. The design, while superior in performance, cannot be produced at a rate consistent with modern total war. It is a weapon for an artist's war, not an industrial one. That sentence captured the heart of Italy's wartime aviation story. The Centauro was not a machine born from the cold logic of factories. It was born from human pride, from a nation that sought to prove its worth through beauty and craftsmanship. As the 1950s unfolded, surviving G55s were quietly retired from service. Some went to civilian collectors, others were scrapped to make way for the new jet generation. A few remained airworthy long enough to appear in air shows, their polished aluminum gleaming in the sun, engines purring with the sound of a bygone era. One such aircraft, restored in the 1970s, flew over Turin during an air parade commemorating Italy's post-war rebirth. As it banked low over the city, old engineers watched from the crowd, men who had once built it under the sound of sirens and explosions. Some wept. For them, it was not merely a plane. It was a memory of endurance, of hope that survived through steel and fire. Today, only a handful of Fiat G55s remain in existence. One rests in the Museo Storico dell'Aeronautica Militare at Vigna di Valle, near Rome. Another stands preserved in the Museo dell'Aeronautica Gianni Caproni in Trento. Each one tells a silent story, not just of technical achievement, but of national identity, rebuilt from ashes. Visitors who stand before these aircraft often notice their elegance first, the smooth lines, the almost artistic balance of proportion. But if they listen closely, perhaps they can sense something else, the echo of an engineer's dream, the hum of an engine that once carried the hopes of a defeated country. The Fiat G55 Centauro remains a timeless paradox, a machine of war created by a people longing for dignity, an emblem of failure turned into a monument of pride. Its legacy endures not in the number of victories it achieved, but in the idea it represented, that even in the ruins of war, beauty and innovation can still take flight. By the 1960s, the Fiat G55 had passed fully into legend. It no longer flew in active service, yet among aviation historians, it became the centerpiece of a fascinating question. What if Italy had been able to produce it in numbers? What if the Centauro had entered the war in 1942 instead of 1943? Could it have changed anything? The question is more than hypothetical. For all its beauty and engineering brilliance, the G55 was a victim of timing. And timing in war is everything. When its prototype first flew in the spring of 1942, the Axis powers were still advancing. Rommel was at El Alamein, German divisions stood deep in Russia, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies of Europe. Italy, though struggling industrially, still dreamed of victory. But as the G55 was perfected, the strategic situation collapsed. By the time the aircraft was ready for mass production, the Allies had landed in North Africa. American bombers were striking Italian cities, and Mussolini's regime was teetering. No matter how good the Centauro was, there would never be enough of them. Still, historians love to imagine the what-ifs. Suppose Fiat had possessed the industrial might of Messerschmitt or Supermarine. Suppose Italian factories had not been bombed, and the nation's logistics had not been crippled by 1943. With a few hundred G55s in service, Italy might have challenged Allied bombers more effectively, at least delaying the devastation from the air. But perhaps the deeper truth lies elsewhere. The Centauro wasn't meant to win the war. It was meant to prove that Italy could still create something extraordinary in defeat. It was the ultimate act of defiance by Italian engineers, to build perfection when everything around them was collapsing. In this sense, the G55 was not simply an aircraft. It was a declaration. We are still capable. We are still proud. We are still Italy. Many of its pilots carried that same duality, pride and despair, in their hearts. Enzo Ferrari, who during the war managed part of Alfa Romeo's mechanical division, later described Italy's engineers of the 1940s as men who built dreams surrounded by ruins. The Centauro was one of those dreams. The aircraft's post-war reputation only grew with time. Aviation magazines in the 1960s began rediscovering its story, publishing test data and interviews with surviving pilots. One 1965 British review called it the most underrated fighter of the Second World War. Another, in Flight International, compared its handling to a Spitfire with a German engine and Italian soul. For Italy, now rebuilding its identity as a peaceful and democratic nation, the G.55 became an unexpected symbol of pride. It represented the best of Italian engineering stripped of politics, a pure expression of creativity and excellence. In museums and air shows, it was displayed not as a relic of fascism, but as a monument to craftsmanship. The legacy of its designer, Giuseppe Gabrielli, was cemented through his later work. The G-91, his post-war jet fighter, became a NATO standard aircraft and served across Europe for decades. But even as the jet era soared ahead, Gabrielli often returned in conversation to his wartime creation. In a 1972 interview, when asked which of his aircraft he loved most, he smiled and said, "The G.55, because it was born when everything was dying." That sentence, simple and poetic, captures the essence of the Centauro story. It was an aircraft born not from victory, but from defiance. Even today, engineers studying the G.55 marvel at its aerodynamic refinement. Its laminar flow wing, clean fuselage lines, and minimal drag profile were ahead of their time. The aircraft's balance between lift and stability allowed it to perform gracefully at both low and high speeds, a rare trait in piston fighters. In wind tunnel simulations decades later, its design continues to impress. Modern computational models show that the G.55 could have achieved even greater speeds with minor aerodynamic refinements and higher octane fuel. It was, in short, an aircraft with room to grow, a design that could have evolved naturally, as the Spitfire did. But it never had the chance. During the war, Fiat engineers experimented with advanced versions. The G.56, powered by the even stronger DB603 engine, achieved speeds over 700 km per hour in testing, making it one of the fastest piston fighters ever built. German pilots who flew the prototype were astonished. One Luftwaffe test report from 1944 stated, "The Fiat G.56 surpasses the Bf 109G in every measurable respect." But by then, it was meaningless. Germany's war machine was collapsing, fuel was scarce, and the Allies ruled the air. The G.56 never entered production. Its prototype was destroyed in an air raid. That tragic pattern repeated throughout Italy's wartime industry. Brilliance smothered by circumstance. The G.55 was only the most famous example, but it represented an entire generation of lost potential. Even as late as the 1980s, aviation scholars debated its place in history. Was it truly one of the best? Could it have changed the war if built in numbers? The consensus eventually formed around a single idea. Technically, yes. Practically, no. The Fiat G.55 had all the qualities of a world-class fighter, but it was born in a country that no longer had the means to fight a world-class war. Its scarcity gave it mythic status. Pilots who flew it spoke of it with near reverence. They described the sensation of power beneath their feet, the smooth harmony of engine and airframe, the way it responded instantly to touch. "It was like flying a living thing," said one veteran, interviewed in 1984. "It did what you asked. No more, no less. It was honest." That word, honest, appears often in accounts of the Centauro. Unlike the temperamental Bf 109, which demanded constant vigilance, or the heavy P-47, which required brute strength, the G.55 rewarded finesse. It was precise, responsive, balanced. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it became an extension of the body itself. There is a certain poetry in that. In a war dominated by machines, the Centauro was profoundly human. It reflected not just technical mastery, but emotion, the Italian sense of style and proportion, the belief that beauty mattered even in battle. In this way, the G.55 stands apart from its contemporaries. The Spitfire was born of British pragmatism, the Mustang of American industry, the Messerschmitt of German militarism. The Centauro was born of artistry. It was the child of a culture that prized elegance even in destruction. For that reason, it continues to inspire modern designers. Italian aerospace engineers often reference the G.55 as an early example of industrial artistry, where form and function merge seamlessly. It is studied not only as a weapon of war, but as a masterpiece of design. In Turin, a restored Centauro now stands near the site of the old Fiat Mirafiori plant, the very ground where its ancestors were built amid falling bombs. On its polished fuselage, one can still see the small emblem of the centaur, half man, half horse, charging forward, bow drawn. It is a fitting symbol, half machine, half human, half triumph, half tragedy. Visitors often linger in front of it, as if sensing that they are in the presence of something more than metal. To them, the G.55 is not a relic of defeat, but a testament to what a nation can create when it refuses to give up on excellence. The Centauro reminds us that history is not only written by the victors. Sometimes it is written by those who lose beautifully. And so, the story of the Fiat G.55 continues, not in combat reports or victory tallies, but in the hearts of those who believe that art and engineering, courage and despair can coexist. When the last surviving Centauro was restored to flight in the early 2000s, its engine thundered once again over Italy for the first time in half a century. As it climbed into the blue sky above Turin, the sound of its Daimler-Benz 512 echoed across the city that had birthed it. People looked up. Some cheered. Some cried. For a moment, history came full circle. The Fiat G.55 had returned home. When the restored Fiat G.55 Centauro took to the skies in the early 2000s, the scene was more than a historical reenactment. It was a resurrection. The crowd that gathered near Turin Airport watched in reverent silence as the polished machine rolled onto the runway. The propeller spun, the V12 engine roared to life with a deep, throaty growl, and a trail of blue smoke curled behind it like memory itself. As the aircraft lifted gracefully into the air, spectators could almost feel time collapsing, 1944 and 2004, overlapping for a brief, impossible moment. Above the ruins of old Fiat factories, now turned to museums and offices, the Centauro once again owned the Italian sky. That flight was the culmination of decades of passion and patience. Aviation enthusiasts, historians, and restoration experts had spent years tracking down surviving airframes, original components, and technical blueprints. Some parts had to be recreated from scratch using Gabrielli's original engineering drawings, still preserved in the Fiat archives. The restoration team faced countless challenges. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine was no longer in production, and sourcing spare parts required extraordinary effort. Specialists in Germany and Italy collaborated to rebuild one from remnants found in museums and scrapyards. Every rivet, every cable, every panel was rebuilt with obsessive precision. The goal was not merely to restore an aircraft, but to bring back an idea, the spirit of Italian engineering at its peak. When it finally flew, it proved something profound. Even after 6 decades, the G.55's design remained timeless. The controls responded smoothly, the balance was impeccable, and the aircraft's stability astonished modern pilots. One test pilot described the experience as flying art. Another said, it felt like the airplane wanted to soar, as if it remembered. The Fiat G.55's rebirth reignited public interest in Italy's aviation history. Museums reported surges in attendance. Documentaries were produced, retelling the story of Gabrielli's creation and its tragic wartime fate. For many Italians, the Centauro became a symbol of national resilience, proof that beauty and skill had survived even in the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Historians began revisiting the broader context of Italian aircraft design during the war. They noted how limited resources had forced engineers to prioritize creativity over mass production. Italian planes, though often underpowered or poorly armed, were almost always elegant and aerodynamic. The G.55 represented the moment when form and function finally achieved perfect balance. Modern engineers, studying the aircraft in wind tunnels and computer simulations, found that the Centauro's aerodynamics were remarkably advanced. Its elliptical wing design minimized drag and provided excellent lift at high altitudes. The fuselage, smooth and slender, reduced airflow resistance to levels that rivaled even post-war aircraft. In purely mathematical terms, the G.55 was a masterpiece of efficiency. But the human story behind it remained even more compelling. Many of the men who had built the Centauro never saw it fly in peace. They worked under bombardment, in hunger and fear, for a regime they no longer believed in. Yet their hands continued to shape perfection. Their craftsmanship transcended politics. One former Fiat worker, interviewed late in life, described the experience vividly. "We worked with bombs falling around us. The windows would shatter, and we would stop, sweep the glass, and keep building. It wasn't for Mussolini, and it wasn't for Germany. It was for Italy. It was for our dignity." That quiet defiance defined the G.55 more than any performance statistic ever could. The war had destroyed Italy's economy, its cities, and its alliances, but not its creativity. And in the Centauro, that creativity found form and flight. In the decades that followed, aviation experts from around the world continued to debate its place in the pantheon of WV fighters. Comparisons to the Spitfire and Mustang were inevitable, but what struck most analysts was how modern the G.55 felt even by late 1940 standards. Its flight stability, high-altitude performance, and structural integrity were all remarkable. The aircraft's climb rate of 21 meters per second matched the Spitfire Mach 9, and its top speed of nearly 390 miles per hour placed it among the elite of the piston engine generation. Pilots praised its visibility and control harmony. There was no abrupt stall behavior, no treacherous tendencies on takeoff or landing. It was, by all accounts, one of the most forgiving, high-performance fighters of the era. Perhaps that is why the Centauro's legend persisted. It was not only fast, it was civilized. It was a fighter that embodied intelligence rather than aggression, grace rather than brute force. To understand why this mattered, one must see the G.55 not just as a machine of war, but as a mirror of Italy itself. The country's identity, artistic, passionate, chaotic, and deeply human, was built into its aluminum bones. The Centauro did not roar with menace like a German fighter. It sang. The aircraft's aesthetics reflected that same philosophy. The fuselage was not designed by committees, but by visionaries. Every line curved with purpose. Every surface flowed as though carved by wind. Engineers did not only think in numbers, they thought in beauty. Even the cockpit layout, clear, simple, functional, spoke of human-centered design decades ahead of its time. And yet, beneath all this refinement, there was melancholy. The G.55 story is a story of excellence overshadowed by failure, of dreams born in defeat. The aircraft never flew in victory parades or adorned propaganda posters. It was never mass-produced, never remembered as a weapon that changed the course of war. Instead, it became something rarer, a masterpiece appreciated only after the noise had faded. When Allied engineers examined the captured Centauro in 1944, they were stunned not only by its sophistication, but by what it represented. One British officer wrote, "In this machine lies the tragedy of Italian aviation. Brilliance without resources, beauty without power." That assessment still resonates. For every G.55 built, there were hundreds of Italian pilots flying outdated fighters, dying in machines that could not match the enemy. The Centauro was proof that they deserved better. It was what Italy could have built, had history been kinder. In post-war Italy, this realization carried a quiet weight. The men who designed and built the Centauro became mentors to a new generation of engineers, the same generation that would later power Italy's rise as a leader in automotive and aerospace design. Fiat, reborn in peacetime, carried forward the same precision and artistry that had defined the G.55 project. Some even say the spirit of the Centauro lived on in another Italian icon, the Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari himself was deeply influenced by wartime aviation engineering, often employing former aircraft technicians in his workshops. The sleek lines, the balance between elegance and power, the obsession with mechanical harmony, all reflected the same national DNA that had once produced the Centauro. Thus, in a strange and poetic way, the Fiat G.55 did change history, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. Its influence flowed quietly into the veins of Italy's post-war rebirth. Even now, when one hears the thunder of an old Daimler-Benz Fi12 starting up at an airshow, there is something haunting in the sound. It is not just an engine, it is a heartbeat. It carries the echo of 1,000 unbuilt machines, of a nation that tried to create perfection while the world burned around it. The Centauro story ends not in destruction, but in preservation, in the realization that some creations are too beautiful to vanish completely. The handful that survive today are cared for like sacred relics, restored with the same devotion their makers once gave them under fire. And when one of them flies, slicing through the air with effortless grace, it reminds all who watch that greatness does not depend on victory. Sometimes it lies in the courage to create, even when creation seems impossible. The Fiat G.55 was not just the finest Italian fighter of World War II. It was the embodiment of Italy's soul, wounded, proud, and unbroken. It remains even now a whisper from the past. A centaur made of steel and spirit, galloping eternally across the endless sky.